Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. First and foremost, I did a 30-minute segment with Yahoo Finance with John Pasalis, the Toronto realtor there. So we kind of went back and forth on our views and what we're seeing in the Vancouver and Toronto housing market. So if you want to get some insights into that, I certainly encourage you to check that interview out. There's a link in the description below to that full 30-minute segment, again with Yahoo Finance. But I want to touch this week first a little bit on CMHC's comments, a couple more comments on that from my aspect, and then I want to really get into the mortgage deferral cliff, so to speak, and immigration or population growth, which I think are the two wild cards to watch for moving forward as we try to figure out where these markets are going. But first and foremost, I want to talk on CMHC because I find it very ironic that the institution, the Crown Corporation that is responsible for basically our entire mortgage market, has put out the most bearish forecast of anyone or any organization out there. And so again, it makes me wonder, second or third level thinking, is that what are these guys seeing? What are these guys seeing that I can't see or anyone else can't see, for example? Certainly these guys have the best access or best data to the mortgage book. These guys are basically in charge of the mortgage securitization machine that they have created, that I would ultimately argue to some aspects is certainly responsible for the significant increase in home prices over the past decade. So what are they seeing on their book? What are those conversations that they're saying 9 to 18% publicly? What are they saying behind closed doors? What do those conversations look like? The second thing that I'm kind of perplexed about is CMHC, when they put out the report, they put out their PDF and their little video saying, this is our projections, 9 to 18%, housing starts to drop off significantly, yada, yada, yada. They're actually running paid Facebook and Twitter ads right now. They're paying for Facebook and Twitter advertisement to promote that report. So it's a little bit perplexing that, again, this government agency would put money behind a bearish report that really is not. If you want to talk about consumer sentiment and economic confidence, so generally speaking, what policymakers try to do is they try to increase consumer confidence. Consumer confidence is what drives consumer spending. It's what gets investment going. It's what brings up the population's morale. So to have, again, a government agency paying money, telling Canadians that home prices are going to fall and fairly significantly, again, is a little bit perplexing. So you can start your conspiracy theories. I'm not sure what their motive is. Again, maybe they are really bearish and they believe that they need to try to save Canadians, or maybe they're just trying to craft the narrative. I have no idea. I just don't understand why they would be spending money to get this message out there. But certainly that's what's happening now. So, but getting back to CMHC, and this is something I talked about in my interview with Yahoo, is that right now, all I can tell you is what's happening right now, and we can only assess probabilities and try to look ahead and say, okay, well, what are the things that we need to be watching for? So first and foremost, right now, like in the Vancouver housing market, and it seems like Toronto is kind of mirroring a similar thing, is the sales have collapsed, but the new listings have simultaneously also collapsed, and that's basically creating a buffer for house prices. So again, what we're seeing in Vancouver is the inventory for condos is stacking up. We're seeing prices come down. They're down about 5%. But the detached segment has actually remained robust because there's very, very few new listings. There's actually an inventory crunch in the number of single-family homes for sale. Now, again, you have to ask yourself, is that sustainable? I don't know. That a lot of that might depend on, let's say you get what happens if you get a second wave in the fall. Let's say you get a second wave of COVID Certainly the people that own single-family homes, which is, wealthier, older boomers, they're not going to want people coming through their homes if you get a second wave in the fall. So I don't think you're going to see an uptick in new listings. Now, that might be the reverse for the condo market, because at the end of the day, you have a lot of new construction that's going to come to the market regardless. And certainly the condos are more of the investor base, where some of these units will be vacant, unoccupied by tenants, etc. So that's something to contextualize. But again, a lot of this is going to come down to the mortgage deferral cliff. So CMHC says, okay, well, 12% of our mortgages are in deferral. That could hit 20% by the fall. But if you look at some of the banks' reportings this past week, those numbers are already getting close to 20%. So Bank of Nova Scotia reported 17% of their mortgage book is in deferral. Canadian Western Bank, 20% of their mortgage book, 20% is now in deferral. And a lot more banks coming out of the woodworks. I think BMO is at like 15 or 16%. Certainly those numbers are inching closer to 20% now. I know factually and anecdotally that some of those mortgages, and I would argue probably a decent chunk of them, are people that are just taking advantage of the mortgage deferral because it's there, it's readily available. So it's not to say that 20% of people are in financial stress, but certainly we know that foreclosures are going to rise, and we know that some of these deferrals are obviously going to result in mortgage delinquencies. So that's kind of number one. And just to add on to that is something that as I mentioned in a Twitter thread this past week, is there's been a lot of talk about the housing market, and because we have these low interest rates, and that they're stimulative, and that's going to provide a boost to the housing market, so any sort of downturn will be mitigated. And while I certainly agree that when you eliminate, quite literally eliminate the bond market, we have the Fed, for example, this past week talking about capping treasury yields, so putting a cap on how much bond yields can rise. And again, that's not if that's going to happen, like it is going to happen 100,000%. So all these people that say, oh, interest rates are going to skyrocket, it's an unlimited money printer, those yields are getting capped. So in my view, it's a lower for longer era. So when you have that, people naturally have to go into assets such as real estate. But these mortgage rates truly stimulative for the housing market? If you look today, 5-year mortgage rates have come off 17 basis points. So you have a deep recession, double-digit unemployment rate, a double-digit decline in GDP, and you have interest rates have been cut by 125 basis points down to zero, basically, and mortgage rates have only dropped 17 basis points. Now, if you go back in history, again, you'll see this chart on the buffer between mortgage rates. You can clearly see that, in past recessions, you've had significant declines in mortgage rates. You're talking about 300, 400 basis points. In some instances, that is highly stimulative for the housing market. That juices it. That creates your ability to take on a larger purchase price when you can effectively lower borrowing costs. But that hasn't been the case here. So that leads me to believe, I'm just going to add to that quickly. I'm going to pull something up here because I don't remember in the top of my head. But you have, for example, in the early 1990s, rate cuts boosted affordability by 120%, housing affordability by 120%. After the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, rate cuts, which subsequently led to mortgage rate reductions, increased affordability by 40%. So this time around, it's been about a 10% boost to affordability, 17 basis points. Again, not a whole lot of room there. So this is what we call kind of pushing on a string. This leads me to believe, again, that in the event that liquidity problems surface, they're not right now, definitely not. The Bank of Canada was able to get that under control. They will have to ramp up mortgage purchases in order to increase liquidity, but that's not necessarily going to help households. That's not going to help them with purchasing power. So that creates a little bit of an issue. So I think that's something to factor in. They say, well, mortgage rates are stimulative. They're not really stimulative because they're not really actually being lowered. Now, number two I want to discuss is immigration. So that's what's certainly helped drive some demand for housing. It's certainly what the media has jumped all over and the real estate community has jumped all over. That, so many people are coming here, can't build enough. Never any discussions about mortgage credit growth, if that might be too lenient, but more so just about population growth. But what we can see is that population growth is highly adaptive to the swings in the employment rate. And so as we get this double-digit unemployment rate, you're going to see population growth slow significantly. And you also have a scenario where, okay, a lot of the immigration has been through non-permanent residents, through people coming here on temporary work visas. Again, not going to come here if there's no jobs available. Again, that should be logical to anyone. And number two would be foreign students. We certainly seems to be like universities are gearing up for online classes in the fall. Again, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to relocate from overseas to here to then rent and sit in your condo and sit on your laptop when you can certainly just do that at home. So there's no need to really travel here. So that's going to be reflected ultimately in the rental market. So we're certainly seeing vacancies are increasing. My discussions with property managers here locally, in feet on the ground, people that work this space, specifically, I'm hearing that rents are down between 5 to about 8%. So that again, as an investor now, you have to look at that and say, okay, well, if I'm going to buy a condo to rent out, and the rent went from what would have been $2,000 a month is now $1,850, $1,900 a month. That needs to be reflected, in my opinion. That should be reflected in the purchase price to some extent. So again, I think these are things that we need to watch for. These are really the two largest things. Is really the mortgage deferrals, what the banks do with that, and how they react, because I think ultimately what drives housing markets, number one, is mortgage credit availability. I think that is the foremost driver of how banks tighten up, how they deal with these deferrals that are going to start to come due in September, October, where the economy is obviously in terms of its getting back on its feet, in terms of do we have that second wave. And then in terms of what the immigration numbers will look like. Again, these are so many variables that are unknown that I just have to laugh of people making housing predictions. And I know a lot of people here on the YouTube channel like to talk about, again, all the doom and gloom. But again, I think it's to me, it feels irresponsible to say that you have a known path of where housing prices are or where they're going to be when these variables are completely unknown. Again, I prefer to assess things in probabilities, and to me the probabilities in terms of mortgage deferrals and immigration are exactly as I discussed, that I think you're going to see a significant decline in the population growth. And in terms of mortgage deferrals, we're certainly going to see an increase in foreclosures. And how does that begin to impact and or shape the market? So that's what I'll leave you with, is those two ideas. Again, I don't think there's any sort of certain outcome. But I think, again, we can certainly try to look ahead to try to get at least a little bit of a better understanding of what the future may or may not hold. So if it brought you any sort of value, entertainment this week, hit the old thumbs up and subscribe. We'll see you next week.